What rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Je dis ce que je pense et je vis comme je veux. Je gagne beaucoup d'argent, mais quand j'en avais peu, je n'étais pas plus malheureux. Oui, mais
Hello and welcome to What Rough Beast. I'm Virginia Heffernan. On What Rough Beast, we try to stay true to our old 2016 assessment that if Trump won that year, we figured the country would lose its ballast. And that if he won again, ever, the country would be lost. Now we take pains on this show not to pretend that the catastrophe hasn't happened. It's not just on the brink of happening. It can't somehow be staved off. America's sitting here in the sunk Titanic, the post-volcano Pompeii, and we on What Rough Beast are trying to take stock of what's around us and even more hopefully imagine what might be built from the rubble. One of the things in shambles in America is our status as a refuge for the world's tired, poor, and huddled masses seeking freedom. This isn't just a question of cartoons of Lady Liberty with her head in her hands. This is a question of America's identity as a hospitable, open-armed host for the world's disenfranchised. But in place of the obvious best policy, the open borders that defined the continent for millennia, and America from its founding up through various limited restrictions to 1924 when the first comprehensive restrictions took place, we now have a Byzantine, zero-tolerance system of supreme cruelty that exists to confuse, humiliate, and injure people, separating them from family, friends, love, and the feeling of welcome. The payoff for this, the spectacle of this cruelty for the rest of us to enjoy, perhaps believing that the exile of the wrong people might underscore the rightness of our own claim to being here. Surely, if they are discarded and tortured, we must be chosen. Lately, I'm thinking about apartheid, World War I, and Gaza. So much ink spilled in those periods, so many editorials and culture wars that divided America along hairline social and political fractures. And opinionators now are dicking around settling scores. So 21,000 people died in political violence in South Africa. More than 65,000 have died in Gaza. And 16 million people died in World War I while they played out the culture wars of their times in newspapers. A case can be made that most Americans didn't know how many were dying in the Holocaust, but the same can't be said of Soweto, Gaza, and the global theater of World War I. So that was happening in plain sight, and we did nothing to stop it. Right here in the U.S., this kind of mass injury with our immigration policies, which have turned into a giant enterprise by a massive centralized government that's spending $170 billion for immigration enforcement, including $45 billion specifically for detention facilities of our money. This is a 265% budget increase that makes ICE's detention system 62% larger than the entire federal prison system. So if you were worried about America as a carceral state, a sea to shining sea penal colony, if you think you were in denial with that one, well, now we have more to deny, or more possibly to face, in the form of the lawless ICE system, which humiliates and abuses immigrants every day for the civil offense of being undocumented, an offense, let's remember, on par with driving without a license. Some of this cruelty is happening in plain sight, the better to be savored by its intended audience, and some of it is happening in the shadows. All of it is wasteful, inhumane, and unspeakably cruel. Today, my guest is the peerless Sarah Stillman, a Pulitzer and MacArthur winner who teaches at Yale and writes for The New Yorker. Her focus is on social inequality, particularly in the criminal justice system. She's covered the rise of the private probation industry, the for-profit immigrant detention centers, and abuses within the juvenile justice system. We're going to talk about Trump's, what to call it, immigration policy, human rights violations, ethnic cleansing. Sarah, welcome to What Rough Beast.
It's really great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I don't know that I've ever used the cliche, "It's an honor to meet you," but it's not a cliche in this case. It is an honor to meet you. I just have admired your work for so long.
Oh, thank you. Vice versa. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah. So, um, I am part of the problem when it comes to the proliferation of punditry and op-eds in Trump times. A lot of ink spilled on culture wars, on the woke, anti-woke pickleball that fills the pages, the op-ed pages, the Substacks, the podcasts, and so on. But you are almost always sticking to what the heart of journalism became in the 20th century, which is investigations. And it worries me lately that while we're playing this pickleball in the op-ed pages, horrible things are happening to human bodies across the United States and the world, and we're doing nothing to stop it. And debating stuff at home about, whether someone who works for Trump is an idiot or not is, while we're doing that, we're not even paying attention to just the astonishingly horrible numbers of people being hurt, including in family separations during Trump's first term. So now we have $170 billion set aside for immigration enforcement. So this is the renditions, the kidnappings, the detentions, the deportations, including $45 billion for detention facilities. Your work has been a lot on immigration enforcement and also private prisons and these public-private sort of macabre collaborations between the government and these private prisons. I wonder what you can tell us about what's going on so far, not what we can anticipate, what's going on so far in these detention facilities where people are being held and, by all evidence, mistreated since Trump took office in January.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see a staggering new reach of and resources behind immigration enforcement on a scale that's not just affecting a tremendous amount of people who previously would have been granted prosecutorial discretion to stay in this country, who are undocumented but may have valid reasons to be here that the legal system has previously granted the right to stay. I'm even thinking about people like, not just DACA recipients, but a really wide range of swath of people fit in that category. But then there's a lot of people whose lives are being radically messed with who are also in the category of green card holders, illegal permanent residents. There's so many. I mean, it would take a lot of time to break down all the different categories of people who are being
Yep.
affected by the current immigration enforcement sweeps. And that includes people, even like many of my students who are here on student visas who are change of behavior, not because they've necessarily yet received any direct enforcement activity in their direction, but because they've seen the videos of young people being disappeared off the streets who actually were validly here on student visas, but now my own students are afraid to even report on some of these issues because they fear that they too may be swept up in this net. So, I mean, I think the issue as you cast it is just so tremendously broad. But one of the things in what you just said that stood out to me, you mentioned, the first Trump administration and the family separation crisis, and you mentioned like so much is going on that people aren't paying attention to. And I actually have been really reflecting on how the family separation crisis in the last Trump administration was one of my first big lessons on how reporting on these issues in the deeply human ways actually does change policy, because I had gotten to the point as a reporter where I was feeling a lot of despair, a lot of that sense of futility that sets in when every day is flooded with stories of immigration enforcement horrors and the amount of suffering that's being created as a result. And I had started to get to that point where I was worried, like, okay, people aren't really going to care about this. And my single greatest failure in my whole reporting life actually happened in those early Trump times, when we later learned that the Trump administration had been secretly testing the policy of family separations before it was announced as a public policy of zero tolerance prosecutions. It was actually quietly, secretly tested. And I found out about a few of those early cases, but I think I didn't know what to do with them because I both got, frankly, tricked by the fact that I thought the Trump administration was radically owning and proudly parading all of the most vile things that they were doing in the immigration enforcement terrain. And so I thought, because they're denying this, maybe there's some truth to those denials. And secondarily, if I'm being really honest, I thought okay, I'm not sure. When I went to my editor, they were kind of like, okay, is this another ACLU lawsuit? We've covered a billion of those. And is this really a story? Because it was just one case at that point. And then I found 2 cases. And then there were 3, but that wasn't yet necessarily a pattern. And it really taught me what we later saw when that story, when, at that time, Jeff Sessions bust out with the zero tolerance prosecutions of public policy. And we saw tremendous reporting on it, and vivid stories being told about the explicit things families were going through when children were being taken from their parents. And when I went down to the border and reported on, watching people before my own eyes being dragged into a courtroom in chains to mass plea guilty to the alleged crime that led to the family separations, I realized like people actually did take to the streets. And it was the first time that Trump had to basically cease and desist with an immigration enforcement activity that he thought he could get away with, wasn't allowed to get away with. And so as I'm watching the current situation unfold, I think we're starting to see some parallels, because what we're seeing in LA with the resistance around some of the significant ICE raids and people kind of actually just regular citizens standing outside with their cell phones documenting what's happening. Certainly thus far it hasn't been enough to cease the policy, but I do think it's important to just keep remembering that the role of journalists in documenting what's actually happening, instead of getting to that point where we feel like it's all futile, is pretty critical to the lessons we learned in the last administration of what gets through.
I think at that point that you thought, well, Trump is doing everything in public to be part of the spectacle of his power. So there probably isn't the kind of thing that we associate with the sort of 60s and 70s where the CIA is up to nefarious stuff and the government is saying something else. Trump's flexing is part of Trump. So maybe it's not as secret. Maybe they're right in their denials. Really interesting way to understand this presidency, and also an interesting way to understand the deportations, because they seem, the ones that we see with, that people take pictures of, seem almost terroristic in nature. They're meant to just scare us and confuse us about what's happening in the streets. And they have that effect rather than a kind of systematic set of deportations that would yield them the kind of numbers that even Biden ended up with, or Obama did in deportations. But it sounds like from what you're saying that both things are going on.
I think we
that
always
there are.
Yeah. What are they doing publicly that we see and know about? And then what are they doing in secret? I think we still need to do some digging around. And then there's the stuff that's in a really weird round. Like I just was talking with lawyers last week about these third country removals. So the people who may have lived in this country for many years, served criminal convictions, and then got removed to countries that they had no relationship to. People who are from Mexico who went to South Sudan, someone from Vietnam who lived in the Washington State area for many years who was sent, I believe, also to South Sudan, and sending people to Eswatini. Those people's, even their own lawyers don't know the current reason that they're being detained, without even the ability often to contact their own lawyers in a third country with which they have no relationship. So that's an example that's, on the one hand, being a form of performance art, I think, for this administration to be, because it was really only, in the South Sudan case, 8 people. But it's pretty expensive to send those 8 people, at least as far as we know thus far, to send them so far away. I mean, why would they go through with something?
These are Mexican nationals that Mexican nationals and
there's someone from Mexico, someone from Vietnam. There's people from an array of different countries. A Jamaican individual who was sent to Eswatini, deported to Eswatini, where he had no prior relationship, I believe. I don't recall all the nationalities, but what we know is in some of those places, they weren't even coming from countries that were refusing to take them back. Like the individual from Mexico could have actually, in fact, gone back as he intended to do after he served out his criminal sentence in the U.S., gone back to Mexico where he was awaiting him, but was instead sent and detained in South Sudan on terms that nobody quite knows the nature of. So that's an example of something that's happening both in a very public way, like the Trump administration put out a press release about it saying these are the most monstrous of monstrous people, something along those lines. And yet they were never fully told, as far as their lawyers can discern, on what legal grounds are they being held in an entirely different country without.
And what is it? I mean, are these deliberate? Well, you say performance art, and yet they haven't been highly publicized. Would the administration later say this is a mistake, like they've done before, to send them to countries that aren't theirs, or this is just some kind of form of deterrence, that we're going to put you in harm's way in a country where you have no family, that it's a little bit some version of, yeah, it's this is family separations on a grand scale, that you're separated from your language, you're separated from, I mean, where do they even stay when they land? Do they see other deportees who also speak other languages? And or are they just being sent to dangerous countries the way the president, describes sending people to prison so they will be hurt?
Yeah, I mean, they're actually being detained. I think that's the most mysterious part about it is that these are people who served out their criminal sentences in the US, and so it's not known why would they be not just de it's known why they would be deported, but it's not known why they would then be detained in some cases, their lawyers allege in solitary confinement, in what appears to be some indefinite state where it's not being explained to them. So that's an example of like the strange disappearing acts that are happening. But again, it
Yeah.
is actually quite public. They put out the Trump administration was very clear about what they were doing for precisely, I think, the reason that you're gesturing towards, which is, their belief in the deterrence power of really
Mhm.
scaring people.
Mhm.
And this
Mhm.
is the kind of treatment that you will get. And so I think one of the really interesting things I'm hearing from lawyers is that they say their clients are actually now often facing the thought that they are afraid to keep living in a country that they feel will dehumanize them. And some of them have signed the paperwork that the Trump administration offered, in some cases to give people $1,000 to agree to just be deported to places that they felt they weren't safe. And in some cases, the clients tried to take them up on that offer.
So, the same way that with the obsession with human trafficking on the right and to some extent on the left, that all of human trafficking is reduced to the sex trafficking of white girls as opposed to labor trafficking, which makes up the vast majority of trafficked humans. I feel like in this case, we on op-ed pages spend a lot of ink on Mahmoud Khalil for obvious reasons,
Mhm.
because lots
Yeah.
of us went to Colombia, and lots of us also are very afraid, journalists very afraid of having our speech curbed, and less afraid of, being someone who got in a knife fight and who was sitting in prison undocumented, was, had a family behind in Mexico that he was hoping to send money to or whatever else. And those are the people whose stories you often tell, which are the, not the most telegenic stories. And maybe you could tell about someone whose story you followed under the recent policies of with ICE that sort of just make us understand what we're missing. Help us understand what we're missing.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers of and types of immigration enforcement going on right now. So if I were to just zero in on, some of the people who've contacted me recently, I recently heard from a school teacher who said that she had a student she had been really close with since he came to this country. I believe she was teaching him when he was in sixth grade. His name is Emerson Colindres. And she basically told me all about how she had become very close with him and his family. And he was a young person who would go to regular ICE check-ins because he'd come here, I believe, seeking asylum. I don't know what the precise form of legal relief he was seeking, but I know that he actually went with his mom to her ICE check-in to try to support her for that. And at that moment, he was actually the one who got detained. This was recently. And the school teacher said ICE had even been coming to the school where she taught, and the school was having to create like lockdown situations where they had to insist like ICE could not come into this high school. And this is a kid who ultimately gets rounded up by ICE and now has been deported as a teenager to a country where he'd fled because he didn't feel safe, which was in his case Honduras. And that was an instance where I thought it was quite interesting. The teacher was saying, she's married to someone who her mother-in-law is a Trump supporter who has thus far supported his immigration policies, but that watching this case of this young person who's really valued in the community be detained and deported with so little process when previously he'd just been afforded prosecutorial discretion and
Mhm.
had been going to the ICE check-ins as required. I think that's just one of innumerable cases where we're seeing. You mentioned like what are we not noticing? I actually think people are noticing, and that was an example
Hmm.
to me. Actually, the community really stood up, and the community protested, and school teachers spoke to the press, and
Mhm.
person himself spoke to the press, and it still wasn't enough to halt the removal. I think
You were saying the mother-in-law, did she actually change her mind about Trump?
Yeah, I think she had volunteered in the
Oh,
class and gotten to know Emerson, and this
I
deeply
see.
s kind of deeply troubled her.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think the more we see situations like that where people's direct communities are affected, which inevitably on a scale of enforcement of this nature, they will be. It's like these are
Hmm.
people who are deeply integrated into their communities and who where in many cases the communities are standing up to say, like, this is not viable and this is not
Yeah.
right. But I think what frightens me is that I would say that feels in line with what we saw in the previous Trump administration, which was like the standard enforcement where previously discretion could have been used. But I think
Hmm.
what we're seeing is just blatant illegality. Like I also just spoke to an attorney where they're filing a lawsuit related to several U.S. citizen children who had their passports, one of whom was a child in cancer treatment who was actually deported with his mom, even in an instance where ICE was very clearly alerted to the fact that these were US citizen children and where they had an alternative to their unlawful removal. And yet ICE and DHS moved forward with that removal. So that I think is the other troubling layer here is that we have like the standard, the stuff that falls into the category of like conversation we could be having as a society of how do we want to handle migration where people are asking for either asylum or some other form of legal relief, like prosecutorial discretion. But then there's this
Hmm.
whole other category, which is just this is like blatantly illegal to remove a person with no due process, whether there's someone with a green card, which is another set of stories I'm hearing regularly of people who had a valid green card, went on vacation, came back, got detained, got held in horrible circumstances, and now they're facing removal for reasons that aren't even being expressed clearly to them, or
Right.
cases like I just articulated of US citizen children being deported. So I think those are like two of the categories I'm holding in my mind right now.
There was some there I cite David Graeber on this show probably far
Mhm.
too often, but
No, no, he's my old professor and, beloved, yeah.
yes. So yeah, the late anarchist anthropologist. He has a really astonishing and persuasive account of slavery um, that the bondage in some ways is secondary to the family separations, because being separated from your family and your language means there's no one around you that believes you're infinitely valuable. So a price can be put on you,
Hmm,
because the world puts a price on can put a price on people, as it does with labor and sex trafficking. Like, there are actual dollars
mm,
associated with how much money is saved if you traffic people for labor or traffic people for sex, how much money is made when you traffic people for sex. But if you're around your family,
hmm,
you're you're worth it infinity.
hmm,
And so once you take away, and then you're not intelligible if you're taken away from people who speak your language. And I've always seen the separations as somehow a secondary inconvenience to the broader stripping of freedoms and bondage and forced labor. But
mhm,
I've really started to see it as integral, that this, and even this policy of family separations, even just when a woman is arrested in a parking lot, we see a video and her child is held back. Um, that is reproduces the logic of of the slave trade. I mean, of something about ripping apart brown families mostly and sending them to all different places. So they remain separated for now, I think in some cases 8 or 7 years since the first Trump policy. Families still separated. And arguably, that is the kind of resurrection of the worst policies in human history and American history. I don't know what you think about that, but I think the family separations are not incidental at all to all of this, and
yeah.
really need to be something that we continue to focus on. What's going on with those separations now? That, like, what happens after the video of the person in the parking lot being separated from her infant?
Yeah. Oh, I think what's important to remember is that term family separations includes so many different kinds of enforcement actions. So the ones that we paid
Okay.
most attention to are the ones that are most easily visually narratable, like the ones we saw when the zero tolerance prosecutions began in the last Trump administration, which was the most literal version you can get of that. Like a child came with their mother or with a loved one to the border to
Yep.
legally present their right to, and we forget that this is a legal right, but we do have an established right in international and domestic law to seek asylum. Many of
Yep.
those people were people who presented themselves at ports of entry even, but who then were visually in front of us ripped apart, and we could see and we could hear, Ginger Thompson's incredible audio that they published at ProPublica of the children like crying for their family. I think
Mhm.
that's something people intuitively, instinctively get. But there's also so many other forms of separation happening within the system. I mean, when you basically destroy the entire refugee resettlement pipeline, you have people who came here with the understanding that, including many people who fought for the US military in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places where they thought they had access to the conventional refugee resettlement pipeline. One person came, and then the rest of the family was supposed to be able to be resettled and now is blocked from doing so. I mean, I could list 20 different applications on the theme of family separation. And I like that you also see the line between what we see in the current immigration enforcement regime around family separation and the current carceral state we live in that also routinely subjects many other people in our country to forms of family separation, including, like, I would argue, the cash bail system and the way our pretrial detention system works, which also routinely, in most of the places your listeners will live, routinely strips people of their right while they're even facing criminal charges, including misdemeanors, of their right to go home and be with their families. I think that's another form. We could just list and list and list like all these different forms of interconnected family separation that make up a big part of like how power is functioning in this country right now.
Yeah.
And
And so, and
profiteering
you
is
also,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
And also how profiteering is functioning, like who's making money off of all this, I think is also a really important question. Like I actually wrote a piece
Yeah.
last year about another form of family separation, which is that in jails across the country, there are for-profit groups that have come in and said, have basically tried to set up elimination of people's right to in-person visits in jails and replace them with video visits. So I interviewed some really amazing kids in Michigan who are taking on a legal challenge against these companies and against the counties, basically saying, like, we have a right to hug our parent. We have a right to visit our parent, often while they're, again, detained pre-trial, or even the
Yeah.
folks who are convicted, like, deserve, I believe, the right to sit across a table from a loved one. And instead, that's being taken away so that a company can make money offering a video visitation service.
That's that right to hug piece in the New Yorker is really it's just the perfect example of how you are able to find the crux of something and investigate it. I think I don't want to push the Graeber thing too far, but I think the touch that you surface, the importance of that touch is in some ways it's something overlooked in liberal discourse where we are focused on individual freedoms. And I have to note that we should be very happy that James Dobson has gone on to his eternal reward, the focus on the family guy that was like the
Oh,
scourge of the and
well,
the
really?
scourge of the Christian life. Yeah.
The
Yes.
original
Uh,
podcast with books on the family cassette tapes that I was given by my grandparents.
Oh, all
Yeah.
right. Well, maybe speak to this too, because we are sort of, I think, on the left trying to understand what is the family, right?
Mm.
Like leftism in the 60s was so much about the individual, and lefty kids are notorious for turning on their parents and rejecting institutions. But now we see the terminal point of the focus on the family, meaning white families who should be having infinite numbers of children and no abortions or whatever, and then other families that don't deserve to be together or even give each other a hug, and these things are deprived. There's an anti-family, anti-natalism going on for most of us, and then at the tip of the iceberg, there's this crazy obsession with family and childbirth. Tell me about why you think that there should be a right to hug, or why these kids who are suing think there should be.
Yeah, I mostly listened to what they had to say. I mean, it's certainly in the science because I think there's a lot of documented research about cognitively. I mean, I think we all felt it even during the pandemic, what it means. What's the difference between only talking to people on Zoom or talking to your loved one face to face and across the table
Yeah.
from them? I think everyone gets it. I don't think we need a ton of elaboration on that. I mean, I do
Yeah.
remember my like intro psych class and the example they gave us of I can't remember the famous study where they had the monkey that was like, they had a mother monkey and a
Oh
baby monkey.
yeah.
The
Yeah,
mother monkey had like the
the
fur.
strange this
The monkey would,
something stranger. Yes. And
yeah,
sorry, go
just
on.
bananas. Would the baby monkey prefer to actually get the food, or would they go to the monkey where they got the cuddles? And like, they went for the cuddles and the feeling of being held. And
Yeah.
I think that feels so central to the human experience. And to me, what these young women I was speaking with who were suing the county for the right to see their dad, they were just really talking about not only the right to that kind of intimacy and what it meant to them, but also at a very young age, they were taught a lot about the surveillance state. Because the other major factor there was that they were told very clearly that, these calls were being recorded. And so they always had to worry, even if they wanted to just talk about something private with their dad and get advice from their dad. I know increasingly in a lot of states, including Florida, not only are the calls recorded, but many of these companies are using AI to do kind of auto-generated synopses and red flagging of people for things that they allege could be problems, which we have a lot of good research on why that could lead to unfair outcomes. But the kids already knew about that. They already had in their mind, even some people I spoke to who were, still in elementary school had an understanding that, they were being listened to and needed to not be fully honest and open. And I think what that does to kids psychologically is also quite profound. To have that sense that the state can always be intervening to that depth in your family life changes the nature of your relationships.
I saw Masha Gessen not long ago saying that, you know, the way to encourage our cohorts to fight this administration is not to say it's not the first they came for the Jews argument that they'll trade unionists and so on, that they'll finally come for you, because they probably will not come for you and
Mm.
me, but that these are elementary violations of human rights and we need to stand up for human rights, just period.
As well.
Um, and what you describe in all your work are violations of human rights that we so recently would have found intolerable. It's like each one of these cases could have been an Oscar-winning movie in the 90s where we would say, what a terrible chapter in American history that this could be allowed to happen to any one of these people, from the boy you described to Mahmoud Khalil. And yet they keep passing. And where is the UN on this? Where is the Human Rights Commission?
When I
Where's the
backtrack,
Hague?
can I just,
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm hearing you and I'm both completely agreeing, but also having this reservation that I'm realizing one of the things I've really noticed in covering immigration specifically is that it's an issue that is so hyper politicized that actually under Democratic administrations, many people who were willing to say under a Trump administration, oh, that's terrible, actually were willing to accept and tolerate an extraordinary
Fair.
amount of family
Yeah.
detention, mass deportation. So it's really
Yeah.
interesting to me. That's part of what I've really contemplated in looking at the storytelling lenses that we use for ourselves and how politicized those can become, that I think it's really interesting to watch. I remember I was working on a project under the sort of the end of the Obama administration, and it was just taking a while because it involved a complex public records FOIA request, and we'd gotten back these images of children who are being placed in hieleras, like they're essentially little freezers at the border where kids are given these little silver blankets that now it's familiar visual imagery, right?
Yeah. Right.
What happened is like editors, it was really hard to interest them in that. They're kind of like, okay, like, yeah, that's bad, I guess. And then
Right.
really those same exact images, when the administration flipped, then suddenly people are like, look, children are being held in cages. And so that was something to think about, like, how do we have moral honesty about what we do and don't? And how do we pay close attention to the ways in which
Yeah.
narratives
I mean,
we're trained to react?
you're absolutely right. And I think that I still, structurally in our profession in journalism, the top of the heap used to be investigative reporters, because I still find it astonishing that just a human without a gun, without subpoena power, can walk through the world writing, filing FOIA requests, waiting, talking to people, and uncover stories that are either hiding in plain sight or hiding in closets, but that we still at least are free enough that some intrepid, enterprising people among us can do this. And you're one of those people. But when we think in terms of op-eds, you think of a whole different thing. It's just the game is completely different. You're trying to score points in the pickleball, and you don't want to hear about things about deportations under Obama, and you want to hear about the most gruesome deportations under Trump because you have your mind on the scoreboard all the time. And I'm just confessing to this. But
I don't
you are,
they're not. Yeah, I don't mean to pretend that, oh, it's all the same. Like, I certainly don't feel that way. And I think the
well,
ramifications.
it is interesting in that the numbers were so much higher under Biden and Obama because they were so much seemingly better organized and also, yeah, less focused on the spectacle. I mean, you can see Trump's focus, for instance, on the ill-fated wall and, the glory that might have come from the unveiling of a very high wall. It distracted him from doing more damage during that first term, that with just more numbers of deportations and more rejections of people seeking sanctuary and asylum. So, I think you're absolutely right. And also Trump's flair for the dramatic makes all of us interested in the dramatic instead of simply numbers. What are some of the stories people deported under Biden or detained under Biden? There continued to be separations. Like he was going to have every 60-day task force to reunite families, and he had, I think, convened one of those reports. Only gave data one time about what was going on with those reunions. Why was that? Why was that a failure? It seems like a great opportunity for them to pull off some reunions, make them very telegenic, repair the damage done by Trump, and win a victory. But what, did it stand in the way of his own immigration policies? Was it just too difficult? What do you think?
I mean, it's tough. Again, I think you're right that I'm not trained up as a political pundit so much as a reporter. So I tend to base things on, what have I heard from the people to whom I've spoken both in these administrations and the people who are directly living it and the people who are litigating it. And I think,
Yeah.
I would argue, I think they are profoundly different administrations from an immigration enforcement standpoint, insofar as
Yeah.
Biden was not focused on enforcement in the interior, and prosecutorial discretion was afforded to many people who, had presented to the courts their rationale. And I think that is a very different world for people to be living in if they have immigration concerns. But I guess we also have to ask the question of, like, well, how did we get to this place where, we're having this conversation as if the de facto assumption is that this is all unjust. And I think it's interesting that we have the electoral evidence that a huge amount of the country doesn't feel this way and feels comforted and spurred along by this approach to immigration enforcement. And I think it's important to ask, like, why and how did we get to that place? And I didn't ever really hear the Biden administration articulate very much about what are the values we have around immigration in our country, because they kind of bought into the same, it seems to me, from my perspective, they bought into much of the same rhetoric about, like, the Trumpian rhetoric to me is immigrants are vectors of, like, crime and disease and bad things.
Right.
And certainly not a discourse around, like, looking at, if we really examine, like, the fabric of who we are as a nation and what we were built out of, and the way our economy functions and the way our communities function. I think, like,
Yeah.
there's so much more to explore there of this conversation that hasn't been happening.
So the original is they're not sending their best Mexicans in his escalator pitch to run for president. They're sending rapists. They're rapists, something like that. So rather than saying they're stealing our jobs, the older argument, or the argument I think made by maybe more sensible sounding conservatives, it became, they're vectors of disease, which seems really important. But in the background, everyone seemed to agree that there needed to be very stringent immigration reform. And, Kamala Harris was very in favor of it. I don't know, immigration reform. I don't know what to call it. The other day, I spoke to Alistair Smith, who's a political scientist and studies dictatorships, made it very clear he's very neutral politically. He's not an activist. And at the very end of the conversation, he just threw in that he's for open border. And I sometimes, when the phrase open borders comes up, I ask myself, what was so wrong with that? It was certainly cheaper. It was more humane and cheaper. All this enforcement that we have now in the budget is taking away from everything, from what the right might have wanted in terms of defense and what the left wants in terms of social programs. And it's just such a snarl. Like, could it be one of those things where, like, give away free lunch to everyone and stop this thing of trying to see if people qualify? Open the borders. And I couldn't believe, this guy, I thought he probably was a center-right figure. And he just said what was wrong with open borders. What would you think? What would be a utopian solution to you? Do you dream of open borders?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I've been thinking a lot about is what is the world we want to build for the reality of like, mass climate displacement? Because
Yes. Good.
unlike before, where one could plausibly say, I think even the whole asylum system that we have was created out of like a post World War II construct where it was like, okay, we're going to pick 5 protected categories. They're really specific ones. If you're discriminated against based on and you're facing danger due to your race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, it's a really circumscribed concept since
Mm-hmm.
people who created it in the post World War II context. But how is that going to function in a world where mass displacement is going to be the norm in the era
Mm-hmm.
of extreme weather events? And I think many people increasingly are having to think about this not just as an academic exercise, but as a direct personal experience. I mean, like, how many of us know someone, my brother lives in California, and in the midst of forest fires, or certainly in the midst of what we saw in LA with the massive fires that even people who were tremendously privileged could not be protected
Mm-hmm.
from, the reality of displacement and relocation. I know people who've uprooted their entire lives and live in a completely different state now. And we're coming on the
Mm-hmm.
anniversary of Katrina, which is one of the instances where one of the crises where we first saw the dramatic and obviously highly inequitable ways in which there's like a long tail to these extreme weather events that are now regular norms. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think it's one of the biggest intellectual exercises that we need to do and have done way too little of, to imagine like what is the legal infrastructure for in a basic like theory around like how are we going to want to relate to each other in a time when we're all going to know the realities of displacement.
And there are very few safe places I mean, there's no place that you can be guaranteed to not have the climate emergency touch you. But there are
Yeah.
very few places. But in the global north in particular, there seem to be serious obligations to take people in. And I don't know what that's going to look like. In fact, I wonder when you mention this, if there's some displaced anxiety, since it's some of the most imperiled states that are anti-immigration, right? So it's
Yeah.
like Texas, like, right? And so I wonder, I mean, not to totally psychologize, but is it some displaced anxiety of like, I can't live here much longer. Like, I'm going to have to leave. And so, yeah, I don't know.
I think that's an organizing opportunity. I did this really fascinating
Yeah.
reporting. This group called Resilience Force that's doing amazing, interesting organizing around the people who rebuild after climate disasters.
Yes.
Started with this guy Saket Soni, who saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there's a group of workers who, came in, and in many cases they were people who were climate displaced from Central America who'd come here to try to help New Orleans rebuild. And then after
Mm-hmm.
that, they went to the next storm in Baton Rouge, and then there was a hurricane in Florida. And so in this emerging migrant labor force, there were people who'd grown up in New Orleans who became part of that labor force, but there was also quite a lot of people who were themselves kind of essentially climate refugees or climate displaced people who became this workforce that now lives in the Home Depot parking lot, essentially in the area wherever there's a major fire or flood or storm, and often spends like an entire year rebuilding. And one of the things that I thought was most interesting when I was following and learning about that workforce's effort to get more labor rights, because they're subjected to like wage theft and all the things you can imagine and working in very difficult conditions. But one of the things that they encountered was that in Florida, for instance, they were often working in disaster struck areas that were very, very red parts of an already red state. And sometimes they had to fear, while they're rebuilding the homes of people, they had to fear immigration enforcement roundups. And so Resilience Force started conversations between the people who were, anti-immigration in their politics, but who were having their homes rebuilt by people who may have been undocumented or maybe recent asylum seekers or other immigrants who were the ones making their lives able to function again. And I think that's just such an interesting area of conversational opportunity, because we are increasingly interreliant on each other. It's like most people might have been affected by some climate thing, and it's quite possible. And I don't reduce immigrants to their labor, but it's when you look at this labor force that helps us recover after climate crises, most of the time you'll have labor in the mix. And it just, I think, complicates the picture of making us really think about what interdependence could look like.
Yeah. Yes. This is, and also make us all feel like this is our homes may be temporary, that we may one day also need sanctuary somewhere else. And that day could be soon, for people in either fire zones or flood zones, which is almost all of us.
For sure.
Yeah, so that precarity maybe is influencing some people's thinking about this. That the resilience force you said it's
Resilient
called?
force, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Very good to know for us and for our listeners. Thank you so much for being here, Sarah. I've kept you a long time, but it's so good to hear about your work, and keep at it.
Yeah, thank you for having this conversation. Really appreciate what you're doing.
Today's episode of What Rough Beast is dedicated to the 180,000 people who have been deported by ICE under Trump so far this term. That's 180,000. This episode of What Rough Beast was created by me, Virginia Heffernan, and Stephen Metcalf. He will be back, I promise. It was produced by Richard Stanislaw and Brianna Snyder. Our founding producer is Joel Patterson. John Jeremiah Sullivan recorded our theme song, Je dis ce que je pense et je vis comme je veux, which was originally written and recorded by the French pop star Antoine. Subscribe to the show at whatroughbeast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Virginia Heffernan on behalf of the whole team. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time on What Rough Beast.
I'm a swanky leftist.